The Wilson DYNAPWR drivers. There has been a lot of hype about these two drivers. Some reviewers out there have been saying that these are as good, if not better, than some of the big boys on the market. We've got the titanium and the carbon head here to go through. I'm going to give you some information of what Wilson are saying about these clubs. I'm going to hit them. I'm going to give you the numbers of them, and I'm going to tell you how they look and feel for me. Let's get into this video. Now, firstly, looking down at these two drivers, like I said before, we've got the titanium version and the carbon version, and I'll get into the tech of these two drivers in just a moment. But looking down at them, you can definitely see the difference between them. Shape-wise, exactly the same, but when you actually look at a little bit of detail on top, you're going to see that the titanium head is very clean on top. No ridges, no lines, no different carbon kind of looks. There's a little bit of texture on the back of it here, and then you've got this little bit of red lipstick that runs around the back. But then you look at the carbon head, very, very different. We've got a seam that runs right the way across the top of the crown. This is where the carbon plate has been put on top, and you can see obviously that carbon texture look as you come down on that club. No lipstick around the back, but both of them have got this little DYNAPWR kind of label on the back of the club as well. Do like the little chevron looking down at them as well, being able to line that club face up nicely to the golf ball. But actually from a profile side of it, not a lot of difference between what I'm seeing, let's say, compared to maybe even like a Hendriksen driver. Very, very similar when I look down at these two clubs to that driver. If we look at the bottom of these two clubs, again, very, very similar. You've got that carbon sort of plate at the bottom of the carbon driver. Again, we'll talk about why they've done that and what that's going to benefit for you as a golfer. But again, looking down at them from the top here, not a great deal of difference. You could actually walk past them in the shop and not see the difference between them. Now for this test, Wilson have sent me the drivers with two different shafts in them. We've got the hazardous red in the titanium, and I've got the hazardous black in the carbon. So when it comes to the actual testing of these two drivers, I'm going to stick with that black shaft. Now the information coming out from Wilson about the face of these two drivers, very much the same on both heads. We've got artificial intelligence, which has created kind of like that rippling effect across the face of the club, trying to maximize ball speed, maximize distance from these drivers with off-centered strikes. Again, we've heard that so much with different manufacturers out there, and Wilson just keeping up with everybody as well. But one thing I have noticed with lots of drivers out there is that when you do get it out of the middle of the club, obviously you're going to get maximum ball speed. But if you do get it out of different places in the club, that ball speed's really going to start to drop off. Looking at the back of this golf club, we've got a 16-gram weight in the titanium head. They're telling us that we're maximizing forgiveness from this club, both of them offering forgiveness from the face with that artificial intelligence, but by pushing that weight further back in the head and giving us kind of more of a neutral to draw bias effect as well with this titanium head. So ultimately, what do I see? I see Wilson offering maybe more of a forgiving head when it comes to the titanium one, which again is going to tick the boxes for so many golfers out there. But what I do like about this club is it does look profile-wise absolutely stunning down by the ball. So just taking the head off this driver, and this is going to be in both of these models, we've got a 6-way movable sleeve in this driver. One thing that I do want to see from these club manufacturers is I do want to see more technology going into these sleeves. And the reason for that is because if I get fitted for this club with that shaft lettering at the back of the driver, as soon as I start to maneuver things, or I have a golf lesson or whatever, I can start maneuvering the loft around a little bit. Well, then this hazardous sort of logo is going to move around the shaft and then start to look at me, which ultimately I don't really want to see that. If you look at someone like Callaway, they're able to move that around and keep that hazardous line looking at the back of the shaft. Now, it might not affect many of you, but it certainly would affect me, and something that I would want to think about, certainly when I'm going into getting a fitting. And then when we move into the carbon head, well, the idea of the carbon is to try and save as much weight as they possibly can, and they've sort of focused on the top part of the head, the crown, and the sole of this driver. So the two panels that I'm looking at the sole and on top here on the crown, like I said, the idea of that is that they can take the weight out of those positions of this head pushing it a little lower and a little bit closer to the face. And the idea of this is to now give us a head that is basically going to be slightly lower spinning. And what I do like about these two drivers when I look down at them is, from a looks point of view, they just look the same. Okay, yes, you've got the difference in the carbon, but the actual shape of the driver very much the same. And you're going to see maybe a smaller head normally with other manufacturers out there when it comes to pushing weight slightly closer to the face and moving that weight a little bit further forward. And whereas in the titanium head you had a 16-gram weight at the back of this driver, in the carbon, we've now got a 12-gram weight. Again, the idea of that, again, pushing that weight slightly further forward, giving that CG closer to the face, giving you those low spin bombers that we're looking for, but forgiveness. So when it comes to the actual face of the driver, very similar to what we're seeing out of the titanium head, we've got that artificial intelligence creating that rippling effect, giving us maximum ball speed, maximum forgiveness off the face with those off-centered strikes. And then maybe more of a neutral ball flight, where we're seeing maybe draw bias out of the titanium head, we're getting now more of a neutral kind of feel or desired flight out of the carbon. But to be honest with you, what I really like about this driver and both these drivers is that the tech and the torque that Wilson are talking about with these clubs is there's not a lot in it. Like, it's pretty simple. They don't go into too much detail with big words and trying to confuse us with all this marketing and technology. They just want to hear what you're getting from the club face, the spin, and the numbers. So let's look at what I got from these drivers. Now, two things I want you to think about when it comes to the numbers of these drivers. When I've set these drivers up, I've got loft sleeve at -1. They both come in 9-degree heads, so I've brought them both down to 8 degrees. Also, the shaft, I've put the hazardous black shaft in both heads for these numbers. That shaft is a slightly lower spinning version of the red one, so we should see some consistency with what I'm getting in these clubs. 150 mile/hour ball speed off the titanium head. If you compare that to the carbon at 152, so gaining 2 miles an hour out of that carbon head. If we look at launch, now there should be a slight difference in this launch because ultimately the titanium wanting to pop that ball in the air just that little bit quicker, whereas the carbon maybe just flattening that flight down just a fraction. But 13.7 launch out of the titanium head compared to 14.1 out of the carbon. So not a lot in it, but they are slightly flipped there. I would expect to see that kind of the other way. If we look at spin, now spin, I've got 2,167 revs out of the titanium head compared to 2,106 revs out of the carbon head. Again, the idea of the titanium is to maybe just spin up a fraction more, maybe making it a little bit more forgiving, whereas there's really not a great deal of it, about 60 revs between the two of them. There is a little bit of jumping around, and that comes down to my strike. You can see that the titanium head is bouncing around from 2.7 in the spin right the way down to 1,600 revs, which is probably a bit too much. I'd like to get that a bit more under control, but that's down to me. And then again, you know, we're seeing a 2.5 spin out of the carbon, and that drops down to around 1,800. So that gap is certainly a lot closer together. If we look at peaking out, 34 yards high with the titanium compared to 36 yards high with that carbon. And then distance, carry distance, we're getting 256 out of the titanium compared to 262 out of the carbon. So seeing a little bit more out of that carbon head, which I kind of expected to see, to be honest, with that CG push further forward. So some pretty good numbers with what we're seeing out of both of those drivers, but ultimately it comes down to me, my striking performance as we go through it. Around 110 mile an hour was my swing speed for both of those clubs. But the last thing I just want to mention is about the sound. Kind of as you would expect, really. If I think of titanium, I think of loud popping noises off the face, tin noises off the face. Whereas when you think about carbon, you think of maybe more of a thud, more of a duller sound. Well, I'm actually really hearing the difference between these two clubs when I'm in here. I'm getting more of a tinnier sound out of the titanium, which some people may like, but I'm getting more of a duller kind of sound out of the carbon, which is what I would like. Well, what do you think? Are these drivers competing or even beating the bigger boys on the market? Would you go and test these drivers? I'd like to hear down there in the comments. Now, from my point of view, I'm not seeing a great deal of difference between these drivers and, let's say, the more expensive drivers on the market, and these ones are a little bit less when it comes to cost. From my point of view, I have not seen a great deal of difference between what I'm getting from a numbers point of view from these two drivers compared to what I'm seeing with other manufacturers on the market. And I'm also not seeing a great deal of split between them, but that might change if you go for a fitting yourselves with different shafts and maybe different lofts. Down there in the comments, what do you think of the Wilson DYNAPWR driver? Don't forget, if you're new to this channel and you like what you're seeing from our videos, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you all again very soon.